Hello everyone. In this video, I want to provide an introduction to working with constraint layout in Android. What I currently have open on my screen is the Android Developer Guide for building a responsive UI with constraint layout. This is currently at developer.android.com/training/constraint-layout. If you haven't taken a look at this guide before, I encourage you to do so now before following along with my demos. All I want to point out here is the most important rule for getting started with constraint layout, which is explicitly stated twice under the constraints overview first paragraph. First, to define a view's position in constraint layout, you must add at least one horizontal and one vertical constraint for the view. Second, each constraint defines the view's position along either the vertical or horizontal axis, so each view must have a minimum of one constraint for each axis, but often more are necessary. This makes sense, right? If we think about a screen in Android, we're talking about a two-dimensional plane, right? So we have an x-axis and a y-axis. So if we're going to specify how a view should be positioned in that plane, then it needs an x-axis constraint, which is the horizontal axis, and a y-axis constraint, which is the vertical axis. We also need to specify how large that view should be, right? What is its size in terms of its width and its height? We'll talk about how we can specify that our views should have variable width and height depending on constraints and the size of the screen. So let's head over to Android Studio. What I have open here in Android Studio is a fresh project. I chose the empty activity template, and that gave us in layout the activity main.xml file, which I have open here. I have it open in the design editor. You can also open this in a split editor or an XML code editor. So in the design editor, you can see under component tree, we have a constraint layout. This is our root layout, and it has one text view, which is hello world. If I select it, you can see these blue squiggly lines. These are 4 constraints that have been by default added to this text view for us. We are going to delete this text view, and we are going to start from scratch with 3 different demos. Let me show you what the demos will look like so you can get a sense for what we're going to build and see if this video is a fit for what you're trying to learn with constraint layout. So first, I'm going to show you how you can set up 4 buttons in a 2x2 grid with constraint layout. We will specify that the width and the height of these buttons should be as wide as possible, honoring the layout margins and the size of the screen. So you can see that 1, 2, 3, and 4, they are equal in width and height, and they're taking advantage of all the available screen size on this pixel preview. If we switch this to landscape, which I can do real briefly here, okay, you can see that their dimensions have changed, but they're still equally sharing the available horizontal and vertical space. If we were to switch this to, say, a large tablet screen, maybe like a 10.1, okay, they get bigger, they're filling that available screen size, so it's very dynamic. All right, next we're going to take a look at demo number 2. For demo number 2, I'm upping the complexity a little bit by saying, okay, instead of all 4 of our buttons having equal width and height, let's say that one of our buttons, button 1, is going to be as wide as the width of 2 of our buttons, 3 and 4. So I'll show you how to set that up. And then let's see how one of our buttons, button 2, can be as tall as the height of 2 of our buttons, 1 and 3. I'll show you how to set that up as well. CL2 is really a stepping stone for CL3, where right now CL2 has all of our views constrained in the upper left-hand corner of our view, of our layout. But CL3, we say, okay, let's see how we can specify that they should take advantage of the available screen real estate and have their view widths and heights be dynamic and equally shared at runtime. All right, so these are the 3 demos that we're going to go over. Let's get started. So activity main.xml. All right, so we've got an empty constraint layout here. What we're going to do is we're going to drag 4 buttons onto our constraint layout. I'm going to identify these buttons as 1, 2, 3, and 4. That way they're really easy for us to refer to when we're talking about setting up the layout. And then also when I show you the XML, you'll know exactly which button we're looking at. So button 1, let's set its ID to be button 1. Let's set its text to be 1. And then I'm going to repeat for button 2, 3, and 4. All right, if we look at our problems, we have 4 errors, okay, missing constraints in constraint layout. We have 1 of these errors for each one of our buttons, okay. Let's just see for 1, it says this view is not constrained. It only has design time position, so it will jump to 0, 0 at runtime unless you add the constraints. We know what constraints we need to add, right? We need to have a minimum of 1 constraint for each axis, so a horizontal and a vertical constraint. We've also got 4 warnings here for hard-coded text. Okay, so hard-coded string 1 should use @string resource. Okay, we know we should do this, but for this demo, we're okay with these warnings being here. All right, so recall, we're working on demo number 1, 4 buttons that use constraint layout to equally share all the available vertical and horizontal screen space. All right, so we're going to pin or constrain button 1 to the upper left-hand corner, and we'll work out from there. Okay, so if you click button 1, you can drag it around, okay, but this is just an absolute positioning. We need positioning based on constraints. So a few ways to do this. First, you can click on one of the anchor points and drag to add a constraint. So this left anchor point is more generally called the start anchor point, and I can start dragging from the start anchor point over to the edge of the screen. You can see that nice blue line show up saying, hey, you can snap a constraint here. This is the start of the parent, which is the constraint layout. So if I do this, that anchor point has now filled in as a dark blue circle instead of an open white circle. Okay, and if I go over to my attributes, I can scroll down under layout and see, make a little more room here. There we go. See under constraint widget that now we have a 0 dp margin on our left constraint. Let's say I want this to have a little bit of spacing between the parent, which is the constraint layout, and the 1 button. So I can specify a 16 dp margin, and you can see that kind of inset our button a little bit from this left or this start edge of our screen. Okay, I want to show you another way that you can add a constraint. So in order to do this, let me show you how you can delete a constraint. So you can head over to the constraint widget, and you can actually just click this little X, and that'll delete a constraint. Okay, let me show you another way to add a constraint. Okay, how we just deleted a constraint is also how we can add a constraint. So I can click Create Left Constraint, this plus sign here, and this is going to snap a constraint to whatever the nearest view in that axis is. So since there was no other view between the 1 button and the parent starting edge or left edge, it's snapping to the parent. And we've got that 16 dp in there because that was what the spacing was already. Okay, if I move this over a bit, I could also click directly on the constraint and hit backspace or delete on my keyboard and get rid of it that way as well. All right, so 2 ways to add, 2 ways to delete. There are other ways, but there's 2 to help us get started. All right, so let's add another constraint. We're going to pin the top of button 1 to the top of the parent, which is the constraint layout. Okay, we see that in the component tree over here. In fact, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. This is our kind of main area we're focusing on right here. All right, now if I look under my component tree, button 1 only has a warning. The problem has gone away because we have 1 horizontal and 1 vertical constraint. Awesome, let's work on 2 now. So 2, I want to be aligned with 1 because I'm trying to make this nice grid layout. So I'm going to drag and add a constraint from 2's top to 1's top so that their tops are going to be aligned. Okay, 0 dp because I don't want 2 to be slightly below 1. I want it to be perfectly in line. Then we're going to do the same thing with 2's bottom. Now you can see this little guideline showing up. 1 and 2 are vertically centered. Okay, they're always going to be centered with each other. Okay, what I should do now is work on the horizontal constraints, right? So 1 and 2 should have a kind of bidirectional connection, right? They're going to kind of equally push on each other. So I'm going to add an end constraint from 1 to the start of 2, and I'm going to add a start constraint from 2 to the end of 1. So I'll show you how to do this. So let's add a constraint on 1. Okay, I'm not going to put very much spacing in between here, maybe like 4. I'm going to do the same thing on 2. I'm going to add a start constraint and put 4 spacing, so there's actually going to be 8 dp of spacing between the two. What I've actually done is created something called a chain. If I pull these out a bit, zoom in just a little bit here. If I click 2 and hold Command or Control on my keyboard, depending on if you're on Mac or Windows, and select 1 as well, you can see that the arrow between 1 and 2 is not the alignment arrow like we see for our vertical alignment constraints, and it's not the kind of zigzaggy line that we saw earlier on our text view that we got by default. It actually looks like chain links. So this is a chain relationship, okay, where 1 and 2 truly have bidirectional connection relationships. All right, let's put 1 and 2 back to just being 4 spacing on both sides. Okay, perfect. I just did that so you could see that nice chain relationship there. All right, so 2 now needs to have a constraint pinning it to the end of the constraint layout, end of the parent, okay? That way we're gonna start utilizing all this available screen space vertically from the start to the end of the parent. So I'm gonna click on it, I'm gonna add a constraint on the end here and set it to be 16. Okay, so now I've got a constraint on the start of 1 and the end of 2 and a chain in between 1 and 2. So now what I want to do is specify that 1 and 2 should equally share this available vertical space specified by its constraints, right? 16 dp margin on the start and 16 dp margin on the end, really constraining this to the vertical space that the parent is providing. So I'm going to click on 1, and in the constraint widget, if you look, we have these kind of greater than or kind of caret signs. These are indicating that the width and the height of this button are set to wrap content, which means only be as large in this axis as you need to be to show your content. The content is the text with some nice padding around it. So if we tap once on the horizontal wrap content symbols, it's going to flip to fixed, okay? And you can actually see that the layout width has now changed from wrap content to fixed. Okay, there might be use cases for using fixed, not in this video though. We want to focus on wrap content as we've seen, and now the next one, which is if we tap again, match constraints. Okay, now you can see the layout width is 0 dp, which essentially means at runtime, figure out what the width needs to be to match the constraints. So 1 is now filling all this available constraint vertical space. 2 is still small because it's still wrapping content. But if I do this same thing for 2, now they're going to equally share that available space. So we're getting one step closer to our final CL1 demo, which is having 1, 2, 3, and 4 share all the vertical and horizontal space. All right, 2 is fully constrained, right? You can see all of its anchor points are filled. 1 is not fully constrained, so 1 and 3 need to have a vertical chain relationship. So I'm going to specify that 1's bottom should be 0 from the top of 3, and 3's top should be 0 from the bottom of 1. Okay, the reason why I'm not putting 4 dp padding here is because you can see there's a natural layout margin around buttons to begin with. So now their layout margins are nice and flush with each other. All right, I'm going to pin 3's start to the start of parent. Now I've got to enter in 4. Okay, I want 4 to have a chain with 3, just like 1 and 2. I'll show you a shortcut for setting up a chain. If we select all the views we want in the chain, so this would be 3 and 4, I can right click, go to chains, and choose create horizontal chain. And it'll make that chain for us. Now I can click on each one of my views, 3 and 4, say your width should be match parent. They're equally going to share this space. The only thing I need to do now is just specify some margins. I'm going to specify them such that they match what I did for 1 and 2 because we're building this nice uniform grid. There we go. All right. 4 is not fully constrained, right? What I need to do is I need to constrain it vertically. So I'm going to say, just like with 2, 4's top goes to 3's top, and 4's bottom goes to 3's bottom. You can always take a look at your constraints and make sure they're properly set up. Sometimes it's difficult to get exact anchor points when you're doing that dragging in the preview canvas. So if you scroll down under layout, you can see the constraints. So let's just confirm. So right here, 4's top actually ended up to the bottom of button 1. That might be okay, but I want to be consistent and make sure 4 is always tied to 3. So I'm actually going to drop into XML and fix that real quick. So here's button 4. So I want its top to actually go to the top of button 3. Here's the bottom to button 3. That looks good. And then start to end of button 3. Okay. So I just needed to drop into XML and fix that. So now if I click on 4, there's those nice arrows pointing to 3. Very nice alignment constraints right there that match 2 to 1. All right, everything's fully constrained except for 3, right? 1, 2, 4, they've all got those closed anchor points, but 3. So I want 3 to actually be constrained to the bottom of the parent, which is the constraint layout. And then since I've got this nice chain with 1, I'll be able to specify that 1 and 3 should have their heights match the constraint, and then we'll start to see this filling of the vertical space. Okay, here they go. Note the alignment is staying consistent because of how we set up 2 to be vertically aligned with 1 and 4 to be vertically aligned with 3. So now let's just set the heights to be match constraint. Looks good. Do the same thing for 2 and 4. Notice that 4 can't be any taller than 3 because of this alignment constraint here. And it looks good. Let's try it in landscape. Looks good. We should also try this at runtime, right? So I'm going to go ahead and build this and we'll take a look at it in the emulator. Here it is. I'm going to rotate the emulator to make sure that it looks good in landscape. I'll note that in order for this to work, you will have to enable auto rotate on the device. So let's flip it. And it looks good. All right, that's it for CL1. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a copy of activity main and paste it. I'll call this CL1. So this will be the one that we did together, and now I can get rid of CL1 solution. All right, next, CL2. This is the layout that we're going to try and build. So back over to activity main. we're going to essentially undo all the constraints we just set up so we can start from scratch. All right, so right click on each one of the views and do clear constraints of selection, and then also change the width and the height back to wrap content. Okay, we're just gonna kind of reset everything here in order to start CL2. All right, so if we look, we've got all 4 of our problems back because we've got no constraints on our views anymore. All right, so let's start with 1. Same thing, we're going to pin it 16 to the start and 16 to the top. We're going to create a chain between 1 and 2 again. Do 4 dp of spacing. All right, I'm going to align 2 to 1 again, so top to top, bottom to bottom. Okay, I'm not going to add an end constraint on the button 2 because if you recall, we are not going to specify that these views should grow to fill available screen space just yet. That'll be the next demo, the last demo. All right, let's set up 3 and 4. So 16 and then 0 to the top here. And then we'll specify that 1 and 3 have a chain. So I'm going to add a constraint below 1. So the bottom goes to the top of 3. Okay, 4 is going to be a little bit tricky. Okay, there's going to be a chain between 3 and 4. So let me set that up. 4 and 4. Okay, nice. 4's top is going to go to 3's top. That didn't work out quite right. I'll have to fix it again. 4's bottom is going to go to 3's bottom. Let me fix that. Bottom to bottom, top to top. All right, that looks better. Okay, now what we want to do is we want to specify that 1 should be as wide as 3 and 4, but I still want a chain between 1 and 2 because when we do CL3, I want 1 and 2 to equally share the available horizontal space. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, 4's end is going to be constrained to 1's end, and that's going to push 1 over so that 1 and 4 are aligned and still 1 and 2 are aligned. Now what I can do is I can click on 1 and look, there's all this available constraint space right here. I can say 1, you should fill that. Now 2, we previously aligned to the bottom of 1, so let's delete that constraint and say 2, your bottom should go to the bottom of 4, and look at all of this vertical space that 2 can fill now. Let's fill it. So now 2 is aligned to the bottom of 4, 4 is aligned to the bottom of 3, and 3's bottom isn't aligned with anything. So this is the end of CL2, where we're seeing how we can have our views width span multiple views widths, and we can have a view's height span the heights of multiple views. Now let's see how we can specify that all the available screen space should be taken up by these 4 views. So this is the end of CL2, so I'm going to copy, I'm going to paste, and call this CL2, and get rid of the solution. We've now solved this. Last but not least is CL3, which is CL2, but filling all of the available screen space. All right, so to do this, we are going to need to specify that 3's bottom constraint needs to go to the bottom of the parent. 2's end constraint needs to go to the end of the parent. And then we're going to come through and say, hey, 1, 2, 3, 4, all of your heights and widths should be match constraints, and then it'll fill all of the available space. All right, so I've got 2 selected. Let's do 2 first. So I'm going to add a constraint here to the end, 16. Okay, now 2, I'm going to say your width should be dynamic. 1 and 2 are now equally sharing the available horizontal space. Okay, this is because of the chain we put between them. Okay, that's really important to make sure that they equally share this space with that chain. All right, 2's fully constrained, 1's fully constrained, 4's fully constrained, just 3. So now we're going to work on our vertical space here. How do we set it up so that all these buttons can fill the available vertical space? So I'm going to add a bottom constraint, set it to 16. Okay, it's nice how everything has moved so far by our constraints, right? 2 is aligned with 4, 4 is aligned with 3. So if 3 moves down, so does 4, so does 2. And because 2 is set to have its height be dynamic, right? It's 0 dp. It's going to fill all that available space that the constraints allow for it. All right, so now what we need to do is specify that 1, 3, and 4 can have their heights fill the available vertical space as well. So let's do 1. Let's do 3. And let's do 4. All right, this looks good. Let's test it in landscape though and see if everything's okay. Unfortunately, it looks like everything's not okay, right? There's some extra horizontal space here that we want 3 and 4 to use. So if I click on 3, we see its width is still wrap content, but we want it to be dynamic, so we change it to match constraints. Same thing for 4. And now it looks good. Let's test it on the emulator, which is a Pixel 4. Here it is, it looks good. Let's flip it. And it looks good as well. All right, I can delete now the CL3 solution because we just solved CL3, Constraint Layout Demo number 3. I hope you learned a lot in this video. This was an introduction to working with constraint layouts and how we can specify constraints such that our views fill all the available vertical and horizontal space on our screen. The last thing I'll mention before closing out this video is you always want to take a look at your warnings and your problems. So you can just click up here. It might be this kind of orange triangle. It might be a red circle. Okay, and look at the warnings, look at the problems. Okay, you might have some issues. You should make sure that you fix those before saying that your layout is done. These warnings here are just related to not extracting string resources for my 1, 2, 3, and 4 button text titles. So that's not related to our constraint layout in any way. So we're good with these, but just because like, oh, it's looking pretty good, doesn't mean you're done, okay? Always check your warnings and your problems here and make sure that you don't have any before calling it good. And test it out, right? Try it out on multiple different screen sizes and orientations. Make sure that it looks good. That's it for the introduction to constraint layout. As always, thanks for watching and thanks for subscribing.